Hey everyone, my name is Banu, and here's part 7 of Ancient and Modern Ships. Another great naval war was waged in the latter half of the 16th century, about 16 years before the defeat of the Spanish Armada. The scene was the Adriatic Sea, and the combatants were Venice with her allies, Spain and the Papal States on the one hand, and the Turks on the other. It culminated in the complete defeat of the latter at Lepanto in 1571. The site of the Battle of Lepanto is very near to that of Actium, and it is a remarkable circumstance that twice in history a decisive naval battle between the West and East should have been decided at the same spot. The Allies possessed a fleet consisting of 208 galleys and 6 galleasses. The Venetians introduced the latter type of vessel in order to meet the Turks on even terms. It was an improved form of the galley with 3 masts, carrying several guns on the broadside, and with most of them mounted on the upper deck. Figure 46 represents one of the Venetian galleasses as used at the Battle of Lepanto, to the winning of which engagement they are said to have contributed materially. The galleass was essentially a Mediterranean warship. It was never generally adopted by the Western powers, but four Neapolitan vessels of this category, carrying each 50 guns, formed a part of the Great Armada sent by Spain to effect the conquest of England. The galleasses, represented in Figure 46, had a circular forecastle in which there were mounted several guns to be used in end-on attack. It is impossible to read the accounts of the Battle of Lepanto and of the defeat of the Spanish Armada without noticing the great contrast between the ships used in the two wars at about the same period. In the Mediterranean, the single-banked galley was still the prevailing type, while in the western and northern seas, the bulk of the Spanish and the whole of the British fleets were sailing ships. It does not appear that any further novelties or improvements worth alluding to were introduced into the practice of shipbuilding till the accession of the House of Stuart in 1603. All the monarchs of this family paid particular attention to the development of the Royal Navy. King James I had in his service an educated naval architect of the name of Phineas Pett, who was a Master of Arts of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and a member of a famous family of shipbuilders who had been employed for 2 centuries previously, from father to son, as officers and architects in the Royal Navy. Some time after the accession of James, a royal commission inquired into the general state and management of the Navy, and issued a report in 1618, which was in effect a project for contracting the charge of His Majesty's Navy, keeping the coast of England and Ireland safely guarded, and His Majesty's ships in harbour as sufficiently guarded as now they are, provided the old debts be paid. And certain assignments settled for the further payment of the Navy quarterly. At the time the report was issued, there was only 17 vessels in the Navy, which had been built during the reign of James. The most important of these was the Prince Royal, built in 1610, and at the time considered to be one of the finest men of war in the world. Figure 47 is an illustration of a man of war of the period, which there is strong evidence for believing was this very vessel. It was designed and built under the superintendence of Phineas Pett at Woolwich Dockyard, and was given by the king to his son Henry, Prince of Wales, in honor of whom it was named the Prince Royal. It was in many respects a remarkable departure from the prevailing practice of the times, and if stripped of its profuse carved work, was very similar in outline to the men of war built as recently as the commencement of the last century. The designer was bold enough to abandon some of the time-honored features of ship construction, such as the beak or prow derived from the old galleys, and the square buttock or tuck. The latter feature, however, continued to appear in the ships of most of the European countries for some time afterwards. The length of the keel of this vessel was 114 feet, and the beam 44 feet. The reported burden was 1,400 tons, and the vessel was pierced for 64 guns, whereof she carried 55, the vacant portholes being filled in action from the opposite side, a custom which prevailed down to the last century, was adopted in order to lessen the deadweight carried aft. The great difference between the shape of the quarter galleries and the forecastle in this ship and in the earlier types will be noted. The armament of the Prince Royal consisted of the following guns. On the lower deck, 6 32-pounders, 2 24-pounders, and 12 18-pounders. The bow and the aftermost ports were empty, and in case of necessity, the former was filled by an 18-pounder from the opposite side, and the latter by a 24-pounder from the stern ports. The upper deck was armed with 9-pounders, the aftermost port being vacant, and filled up when required. The quarterdeck and forecastle were provided with 5-pounders. The building of this ship aroused many apprehensions, and a commission was appointed to report on the design while it was being constructed. It certainly seems that gross errors were made in the calculations while it was being constructed. For instance, it was estimated that 775 loads of timber would be required for a construction, whereas 1,627 loads were actually used. The timber also was so unseasoned that the ship only lasted 15 years and had then to be rebuilt. Many complaints were made about this time of the incapacity and ignorance of English shipbuilders. Sir Walter Raleigh laid down the following as the principal requirements of warships: strong build, speed, stout scantling, ability to fight the guns in all weathers, ability to lie easily in a gale, and ability to stay well. He stated that in all these qualities the royal ships were deficient. He also called attention to the inferiority of our merchant ships, and pointed out that whereas an English ship of 100 tons required a crew of 30 hands, a Dutch vessel of the same size would sail with 1/3 of that number. Another authority of the time complained that he could never see two ships builded of the like proportion by the best and most skilful shipwrights, because they trust rather to their judgment than their art, and to their eye than their scale and compass. The merchant navy of England languished during the early years of the reign of James I. Owing, however, to the patronage and assistance extended by the king to the East India Company, and also in no small measure to the stimulus caused by the arrival of some large Dutch merchantmen of the Thames, the merchants of London abandoned the practice of hiring ships from foreigners and took to building for themselves. In the year 1615, there was not more than 10 ships belonging to the port of London with a burden in excess of 200 tons, but owing to the sudden development of shipbuilding, the port of Newcastle in the year 1622 owned more than 100 ships, exceeding the above-mentioned tonnage. In the year 1609, the king granted a new charter to the East India Company, and the following year a vessel called the Trade's Increase was sent out. The ship was the largest merchantman built up to the time in England. Her career, however, was not fortunate. She was careened in Bantam in order that some repairs to her hulls might be effected, but she fell over on her side when it was burnt by the Javanese. Before the year 1613, British merchants had made altogether 12 voyages to the East Indies, for the most part in ships of less than 500 tons. In that year, however, all the merchants interested in the Oriental trade joined together to form the United East India Company. The first fleet fitted out by the reorganized company consisted of 4 ships of 650, 500, 300, and 200 tons burden, respectively. It had to fight its way with the Portuguese before it could commence to trade. The Portuguese considered that they were entitled to a monopoly of the trade with the East, and jealously resented the intrusion of the English merchantmen, whom they attacked with a fleet of 6 galleons, 3 ships, 2 galleys, and 60 smaller vessels. They were, however, ignominiously defeated, and the English merchantmen were unable to accomplish their purpose. During the last 5 of the years of the reign of James I, the strength of the Royal Navy was increased 25%. His son and successor, Charles I, through all the troubles of his eventful reign, never neglected this branch of the national defenses, and during his reign the mercantile marine grew to such an extent that at the time of the outbreak of the Civil War, the port of London alone was able to furnish 100 ships of considerable size, all mounting cannon and fitted up in every respect for the operations of war. The Sovereign of the Seas, illustrated in Figure 48, may be taken as an example of the largest type of warship built by Charles. Like the Prince Royal, she was designed by Pett, and was considered to be the most powerful man of war in Europe of her time. Her construction must have been a great improvement on that of the Prince Royal, for whereas the latter ship was declared to be no longer fit for service 15 years after her launch, the Sovereign of the Seas, though engaged in most of the naval battles of the 17th century, remained in good condition for a period of 60 years, and was then accidentally burnt at Chatham when about to be rebuilt. She was the first 3-decker in the Royal Navy, but as she proved somewhat crank, she was cut down to a 2-decker in the year 1652. At the Restoration, she was renamed the Royal Sovereign. This very remarkable vessel was of 1,683 tons burden. Her length of keel was 128 feet. Length overall was 167 feet, with a beam of 48 feet and 4 inches. The depth from the top of the lantern to the bottom of the keel was 76 feet. She was built with 3 closed decks, a forecastle, a half deck, a quarter deck, and a roundhouse. She carried in all 102 or 104 guns and was pierced for 30 guns on the lower, 30 on the main, and 26 on the upper deck. The forecastle had 12, and the half deck 14 ports. She also carried 10 chasers forward and as many aft. She was provided with 11 anchors, of which one weighed 2 tons. The Royal Sovereign may fairly be taken as representing the commencement of a better school of ship construction. Her merits were due to the talents of Phineas Pett, who, though not uniformly successful in his earlier designs, was a great innovator and is generally regarded as the father of the modern school of wooden shipbuilding. Very little is known, unfortunately, of the character and rig of the smaller classes of trading vessels of the end of the 16th and the commencement of the 17th centuries. It is, however, tolerably certain that cutter-rigged craft were used in the coasting and Irish trades as far back as 1567, for there is a map of Ireland of that date in existence on which are shown 2 vessels rigged in this manner. With a description of the Royal Sovereign, we close the account of medieval naval architecture. Thanks to the fostering care of Charles I, to the genius of Pett, and to the great natural advantages conferred by the superiority of English oak to other European timbers, England at this period occupied a high place in the art of shipbuilding. The position thus gained was maintained and turned to the best advantage in the period of the Commonwealth, when successful naval wars were undertaken against the Dutch and other European states. These wars eventually resulted in establishing England for a time as the foremost maritime power in Europe. Chapter 5: Modern Wooden Sailing Ships. The naval wars which followed the establishment of the Commonwealth contributed in a very large degree to the process of shipbuilding. In 1652, war broke out with the United Provinces, headed by the Dutch, who were prior to that period the foremost naval and mercantile power in the world. The struggle lasted about 2 years, and during its continuance the British fleet increased from 55 first, second, and third rates to 88 vessels of corresponding classes, while a proportionately larger increase was made in ships of smaller denominations. In addition, the vessels lost in the war were replaced. The war with the Dutch was an exceptionally severe struggle and ended in the complete victory of this country, which then stepped into Holland's place as the foremost naval power. In addition to this war, Cromwell undertook an expedition to the Mediterranean to punish the piratical states of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. The fleet was commanded by Blake, and was completely successful in its operations, which resulted in a security for British commerce with the Levant that had never been known before. Admiral Penn was at the same time entrusted with the command of a powerful expedition to the Spanish West Indies. The annexation of Jamaica followed, and British commerce in the West increased. In fact, with the progress of the national navy, the commerce of the country also extended itself, and the increased experience thus obtained in shipbuilding, both for the war and trading fleets, necessarily resulted in great improvements in the art. The expenditures on the navy in the time of the Commonwealth were enormous relatively to the total national revenue. In the years 1656 to 1657, 4/5 of the income of the country was devoted to the sea service. In the following year, 2/3, and in 1658 through 59, nearly 3/5. These are figures which have never been approached at any other period. The ships built during this time were of moderate dimensions. Only 4 were of 1,000 tons. These were the Dunbar of 1,047 tons and 64 guns, built in 1656, the London, built in the same year of the same tonnage and number of guns, though of different dimensions, the Richard of 1,108 tons and 70 guns, built in 1658, and the Naseby, built in 1655, of 1,229 tons and 80 guns. All 4 were renamed at the Restoration. Charles II and his brother, the Duke of York, afterwards James II, both possessed in an eminent degree the fondness for the navy which distinguished all members of the Stuart dynasty. Though unfortunately after the first naval war waged by Charles against Holland, the condition of the fleet was allowed to deteriorate very rapidly. As a sample of the type of warship of the first class built in this reign, we give in Figure 49 the Royal Charles, which was constructed at Portsmouth Dockyard in 1673 by Sir Anthony Deane to carry 100 guns. This illustration and that of the Sovereign of the Seas are after pictures by Van de Velde. This ship was the largest in the navy, excepting always the famous old Sovereign of the Seas and the Britannia. The latter was built at Chatham by Pett in 1682 and carried 100 guns and measured 1,739 tons. The Royal Charles created as much sensation in its day as did the famous ship built for Charles I. There is a beautiful model of the Royal Charles in the museum. Figure 50 is an illustration after Van de Velde of a famous French first-rate of the same period, named the Soleil Royal, of 106 guns. She was destroyed in Cherbourg Bay the day after the Battle of Cape La Hogue in 1692. Figure 51 is a Dutch first-rate named the Hollandia of 74 guns. She was built in 1683 and took part in the Battle of Beachy Head as flagship of Admiral Cornelius Evertsen. The chief difference between the British and foreign builds of warships of the latter half of the 17th century was that the English vessels were always constructed with the rounded tuck, before mentioned as introduced by Pett, while the continental ships all had the old-fashioned square tuck, which is well illustrated in Figure 51. The Dutch ships, in one respect, excelled all others in that they were the first in which the absurd practice of an exaggerated tumble-home or contraction of the upper deck was abandoned. This fashion was still carried out to a great extent by the English and to a less extent by the French and Spaniards. The chain plates in the English vessels were also fixed extremely low, while the Dutch fixed them as high as the sills of the upper deck ports would allow. In consequence of the shallowness of the Dutch harbors, the draught of their ships was also considerably less than that of the English vessels of corresponding force. Most of the ships in the 17th century fleet deemed fit to take their station in the line of battle were third rates. The first and second rates were exceptional vessels and were only employed in particular services. A comparative table of the dimensions and armament of the various rates or classes in the year 1688 is annexed below. The first so-called frigate was designed by Peter Pett and built at Chatham in 1646. She was named the Constant Warwick. Her dimensions were the length of the keel at 85 feet, the breadth at 25 feet, 5 inches, a depth of 13 feet, 2 inches, the tonnage at 315, guns 32, a crew of 140. She worked havoc amongst the privateers of the time. The bomb ketch was originally introduced by a famous French naval architect named Bernard Renan at about 1679. This class of warship was first employed by Louis XIV in the bombardment of Algiers, where it produced an enormous effect. Bomb ketches were of about 200 tons of burden, very broad in proportion to their length, and built with great regard to strength, on account of the decks having to bear the downward recoil of the mortars. The latter were placed in the forepart of the vessel, which was purposefully left unencumbered with rigging. The hold between the mortars and keel was closely packed with old cables, cut into lengths. The yielding elastic qualities of the packing assisted in taking up the force of the recoil. The bombs weighed about 200 pounds, and the consternation and terror produced by them may be readily realized when it is remembered that up to the time, the most dangerous projectile which a warship could discharge at a land fortification was a 32-pound shot. These vessels were fitted with 2 masts, one in the middle and the other in the stern. Alright everyone, that's it for part 7, and I'll see you all next time.